Now, monetization in gaming isn't a new topic for this channel or just in general. Debate and discourse over what is or is not good value for digital cosmetic, or what should be free content included with a game versus paid DLC, or what constitutes an ethical monetization model, like that stuff has all been covered plenty. However, an important part of the conversation that I think needs to happen more is evaluating the question of how we, as the audience, have built up a tolerance to the ways that modern game monetization has gotten worse. After all, it hasn't always been like this, and whenever publishers have escalated things by introducing a new obscenely expensive content drop or popularizing a new exploitative monetization model, or just monetizing something that players have grown to expect to be base game content, there's always been some pushback. And yet, it still feels pretty hard to argue that we haven't been sliding into worse and worse territory over time with this stuff. Like, one of the easiest ways to measure this, in my opinion, is to look back on what counted as an insane microtransaction scandal from different points in the medium's history. Something like Oblivion's Horse Armor DLC, once the pinnacle of insane nickel and diming DLC practices for lackluster content that should have just been a free update, seems kinda quaint in contrast to stuff like the $500 Faker RE skin bundle in League or the $80 Mythic Reinhardt weapon skin. There's always been backlash to stuff like this, and sometimes it's been backlash that has legitimately hurt a company or a game. But given how lucrative these practices generally seem to be for the companies that implement them, and given how they keep doing it, it can sometimes feel like the audience's words don't match their actions. Is this a matter of just a very loud minority of gamers who push back, not really reflecting the broader majority who just don't mind this stuff? Or is it maybe a matter of hypocrisy? Of players being furious on Twitter, but then still pulling out the credit card when nobody's looking? Or is there something else to it? And that's the topic I want to explore today. How do we, as the audience, react to the increasingly hostile monetization in gaming? Why do we seem to be developing a tolerance to being gouged? And, maybe even more importantly, what are some of the mistakes I think people make when they try and comment on this sort of thing? Part of why I think this is an interesting topic is that a lot of the debate tends to focus on and blame the consumer. After all, no one's making you pay for these things, and the only reason companies keep doing it is because clearly enough people are paying for it, so it must be the fault of whoever's buying that $500 RE skin that the $500 RE skin exists. But I think that ignores a lot of the power that corporations have over us, and glosses over how much time, money, and energy goes into finding ways to manipulate consumers, including manipulating us into seeing one another as the problem when corporations start gouging. But anyways, that's enough rambling for the intro. Let's get into the actual topic. Part 1. The Boiled Frog. If you've ever listened to any commentary on this subject before, you've probably heard the analogy of the boiled frog being brought up from time to time. The story goes that if you try and put a frog into a pot of boiling water, it'll immediately panic and try and flee, obviously. However, if you put a frog into a pot of lukewarm water and very slowly increase the temperature until it's eventually boiling, the frog will just sit there and not realize what's happening to him as he's eventually boiled to death. The idea behind it is that we're just much better at noticing and responding appropriately to danger when it's a jarring, noticeable difference from our existing status quo, but we tend to fail to notice and react to danger that's very gradually increased in ways that aren't immediately perceptible from moment to moment. And it's not hard for me to see why this has been a compelling narrative in this subject. After all, we do tend to be really bad at noticing change when we're constantly observing something as it very slowly changes over time. A kid isn't really going to perceive themselves as growing taller over the span of a year because they see themselves in the mirror every day, and the extent of how much they grow in between each time they observe themselves is so tiny that it's imperceptible. Same goes for their parents, or their siblings, or maybe their teachers, their friends at school, people who are seeing them constantly and so aren't going to notice. However, their relatives who maybe only see them a couple times a year will have their points of observation spread out far enough that they're a lot more likely to be able to recognize if you've grown a few inches over that period of time. Another example of this sort of thing is weight loss or muscle growth. Part of what makes long-term commitments to exercise and diet and fitness really hard is that it's a really slow process. 2 pounds a week is the maximum that's healthy to lose for most people. And even if you are constantly maxing out on weight loss, you're still not really able to see it when you look in the mirror day to day, or even comparing progress photos from week to week. Muscle growth is even slower. It might take a month to develop even a pound or two of lean muscle. And obviously that sort of thing can make it hard to stay motivated because you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you're feeling like you're not seeing any change, even if you know that after 6 months you're gonna hit some goals. However, somebody who only sees you once every 6 months is definitely gonna notice if you've lost 20-something pounds of fat or gained 10-ish pounds of muscle since the last time you saw them. When we're talking about the boiled frog in the context of gaming and monetization, the argument is basically just that publishers have been very slowly ratcheting up the heat to boil us without us noticing. And so we just keep acclimating to the slowly increasing heat without realizing how bad it's been getting. The problem with this mentality is that, obviously, this isn't remotely how this process has gone. It hasn't been a slow, gradual process, and it hasn't been a process that we've gone without noticing. Again, you can point to any number of microtransaction controversies over the last few years, ranging from that Oblivion Horse Armor DLC all the way back in 2006, to stuff like the Star Wars Battlefront 2 microtransactions, to loot boxes, to battle passes, to rotating in-game shops, to absurdly priced prestige cosmetics, to gacha, and so much more. I guess this might be a controversial hot take to some, but I don't think that the gamers, TM, have been particularly silent about monetization practices when they don't like them. Like, this stuff isn't going without comment. The Horse Armor DLC was basically a two-word joke and punchline all by itself for years. A derogatory label that was applied to any DLC that gamers felt was comically absurd to charge real money for. And this also just makes sense once you actually think about the boiling frog for like 30 seconds. A frog isn't that stupid. Once the water gets too hot, it'll just jump out if it can, the same way that you'd eventually get out of a shower if the water slowly got too hot to tolerate long before you got boiled to death. You'd probably be able to tolerate more heat than normal if the shower gradually got hotter, but you would have to have a part of your brain removed before you'd sit there and let it kill you. And that's not an exaggeration either. In 1869, Friedrich Goltz tried to prove this theory, and it turned out that it was true that a frog can be boiled if the heat was increased slowly enough. But crucially, that frog had to literally have its brain removed. The frogs with intact brains simply jump out of the pot because obviously. All of that to say that this just isn't a very useful explanation for why things are the way they are for a bunch of reasons. For one, people are actually capable of recognizing if things get bad even if it's been a gradual change, much less when it's often jarring changes like it's been with gaming monetization. There has been pretty consistent pushback whenever there's been escalation, and lots of people do quit playing games once the monetization gets to be too much for them. And even if they don't quit playing them, they might still stop spending money on it. However, something that is worth exploring is why our standards have shifted so much over time. Like, I keep bringing up the horse armor because it's such an iconic monetization controversy, but if you weren't around and actively consuming gaming industry news in 2006, you might almost find that a bit quaint. Like, people really got outraged over $2.50 for in-game horse armor? That's nothing. That's the kind of monetization that'd be framed as like borderline charitable in modern gaming half the time. And even for those of us who were there, it's sometimes funny to imagine horse armor being controversial within the modern context of shit like a $500 Ari skin bundle. After all, things have changed so much and gotten so much worse that the awful practices of the past just don't seem so bad anymore. Right? Part 2. The Ratchet Effect. This one's going to be a bit of a longer explanation, so just bear with me for a sec. The Ratchet Effect is a term typically used in a political context to refer to a scenario where, between two political forces, one side will consistently pull the Overton window, which is a term used to refer to the range of political views and policies that are considered normal or moderate to the general population, further and further over to their side. Then, once the other side or another party takes power, they will not pull the window back to where it previously was. Instead, they'll accept the Overton window's new position as the default and will operate relative to it rather than to their old positions. Any real-world example of this would just get contentious, so to put it into a hypothetical, imagine you have Party A and Party B campaigning for office. Party A's true position on a particular policy reflects a 2 out of 10, while Party B's true position is an 8 out of 10 on that same scale. But the general public only really considers a range of 4 to 6 to be a moderate acceptable range, so Party A campaigns for 4 and Party B campaigns for 6, the furthest they can campaign in favor of their original positions without seeming extreme to the general public. Party A wins the election, and they immediately implement policies that reflect a 3, something that breaks their promise and that the general public considers to be extreme. However, by the time the next election comes, Party B isn't campaigning for 6 anymore. They're campaigning for 4 with a true position of 6, believing 8 to be impossible now, and Party A is campaigning for the 2 that they originally believed in. The general public, angry that Party A broke its promise and looks like it's going to go even further, is willing to vote for Party B, who's committing to meet that promise of 4 that Party A broke. So Party B gets into office and they move the policy back to a 4. Come that next election though, Party B is campaigning to keep the policy at 4 while Party A is still campaigning for 2. And after however many years of the debate being between 2 and 4, that starts to become the new Overton window. Party A maybe went too far by going to 3 when they promised 4, but now Party B agrees that 4 is an acceptable option, and that 3 is the compromise between the two positions. And crucially, campaigning for 6 like Party B once did would now be seen as an extreme position. And they don't want to be seen as extremists, they want to appeal to the moderates, the centrists, so they keep moving to meet centrists where they're at. Squarely in the center of that moving Overton window. Party B, if given enough power, will meet Party A where they're at, while Party A will consistently use its time and power to try and force Party B to follow them as far as possible. And while it might make Party A seem extreme at times, Party B's acquiescence to their framing will eventually make Party A seem more moderate in hindsight. The Ratchet Effect works because, on a pretty fundamental level, we have a really strong desire to be normal. And normal is relative. The The Overton window constantly moves, and there are a lot of people who will shift their positions to meet it because that's what feels like the normal moderate position to have. Like, a lot of people put a lot of weight on just having normal, reasonable, compromised political positions without really considering whether or not the things they're compromising are reasonable. If Party A says 4 and Party B says 6, that makes 5 feel like the moderate compromise position. If Party A moves to 3 and Party B moves to 5 to meet them, 5 is no longer the compromise, it's the Party B position. And of course, this is all a false framing. There's no real reason to assume that the best policy must be somewhere between the range of options being presented by Party A and Party B. One of the two might just objectively be correct, or they both might be completely wrong. Now, what does this all have to do with gamers getting gouged? Well, because in a lot of ways the Ratchet effect works similarly to the boiling frog thing, but with the notable difference that the Ratchet effect doesn't need to be subtle or go unnoticed in order to have the same effect of moving your normal position increasingly closer to a bad outcome. And there isn't really an opportunity to escape. A ratchet, like a ratchet strap, is something that's built to increase tension and maintain tension, but not release tension, meaning that whatever tension you've introduced to it will become the new normal. In gaming, this feels like a more accurate assessment of what's happened. A publisher will put out some egregious monetization bullshit, we'll all get angry about it, but then it will have successfully ratcheted the discourse further in favor of bullshit monetization. When Overwatch 1 came out, it wasn't the first to use loot boxes. It was capitalizing on the work that had been done by other companies to ratchet the norms around monetization so that its monetization practices would seem benign or even consumer-friendly relative to other games because they were just cosmetic loot boxes. Lots of people back in the day praised Blizzard for cosmetic-only loot boxes rather than offering gameplay advantages through them. But then, more and more games introduced loot boxes that did offer gameplay advantages, or in other ways exacerbated things. There was some pushback, sure, but publishers generally succeeded in ratcheting up the discourse to the point where it wasn't going to break. At least until you got something like Star Wars Battlefront 2, which became the standard for bad monetization across kind of everything, whereas Overwatch or Apex or Fortnite were seen as generally good monetization standards in comparison, or at least as neutral ones. Then you've got stuff like gacha games, which are basically just games where the entire thing revolves around loot boxes featuring new characters and weapons. Overwatch probably never would have gotten away with locking its new characters or gameplay perks behind loot boxes back in 2016. Again, stuff like Star Wars Battlefront 2 got hammered for basically doing exactly that, but Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail or Wuthering Waves or Zenless Zone Zero explicitly do that, and it mostly gets a pass. And the industry is going to look at that and see that it worked and adopt it eventually, or at least adapt it to their own needs. And this isn't a straightforward process either. People will excuse things more if they generally feel positive towards the game, like they did with Overwatch 1, but they'll also be way less forgiving if they feel negatively about it, like what's happened a lot with Overwatch 2's change to a rotating shop and heroes being locked behind the battle pass at launch. People like the characters in games like Genshin and Honkai, and so even if they don't love having to pull for them, they're still willing to do it, at least for now. Speaking of gacha, this also all depends pretty heavily on genre. MMORPGs have been charging subscription fees to play their games forever, which is just a normalized practice at this point. But if Fortnite ever started demanding $15 a month to play past a certain level, I think you'd see people storming Epic HQ. Instead, they do stuff like battle passes, which can get the same effect in a lot of ways without being a mandatory subscription to keep playing. When it comes to mobile gaming, you'll often have energy systems where you can wait for time to pass in order to keep playing, or you can pay to recharge your energy so you don't have to wait. But if a game like Hades only allowed you 10 runs a day and would make you wait an hour for a run to recharge unless you paid $10, that would probably never fly. It's also important for us to consider how games are being priced and how that plays a role in this. Up until very recently, it actually wasn't that normal for a game to be free to play and make its money entirely through microtransactions. The practice began in 1997 with a game called Achaea Dreams of Divine Lands, I am so sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, where players could pay for a premium currency to buy better equipment. This model was generally quarantined to MMOs, or mobile games, or browser games for the majority of the 2000s, with MMOs starting to move away from their traditional subscription model to the free-to-play microtransaction model towards the end of the decade. There were games and other genres that began experimenting with it around that time as well, and while not everything was a success, there was enough success for it to start catching the eyes of more and more developers across more and more genres. Throughout the 2010s, this stuff just became increasingly common, especially with the rise of stuff like Battle Royale games like Fortnite or PUBG, which require a ton of players to fill big matches, so it's beneficial. And as it proved its viability as a model, it got adopted by more and more games. Nowadays, it's pretty common for a major AAA multiplayer title to be released as a free-to-play title with microtransactions, but even though the practice itself is old, its prevalence across mainstream gaming really isn't. Overwatch is actually kind of useful to look at here because we can really see how quickly the mentality shifted. In 2016, Overwatch was launched as a $40 USD game with microtransactions on top. But in 2022, Overwatch 2 was launched as a free-to-play game with a battle pass, rotating shop, premium currencies, and more. Once we've been forced to adjust to a new normal, we pretty quickly move on from the old normal. Adaptability is a strength, but it's a strength that can be exploited by companies who want you to quickly normalize their new, shitty practices so they can keep moving on to making them even worse. However, a pretty important part of the mechanism of a Ratchet is the release. Sure, a Ratchet can only pull in one direction and it'll lock up to prevent backwards movement, but there's usually going to be a release mechanism. The question then is, why doesn't somebody pull the release? It's not like there's just one singular publisher dictating monetization in all games. Wouldn't it make sense for more companies to try and set themselves apart by not engaging in these practices? Well, no. Part 3. Competitors and Collaborators. Part of the reason why these practices get widely adopted is because once the norm is established, there's really not a reason to roll it back to a more consumer-friendly position. We all exist under capitalism, and under capitalism, private companies like those in the gaming industry have an incentive to maximize profits regardless of whatever else. Customer satisfaction only matters to the extent that it impacts profits, but if you make more money with an anti-consumer change than you would lose, then so be it. The Ratchet effect also requires that there are at least two opposing forces who have the capacity to introduce a new policy, and one is just choosing to never pull away from the new norms that the other establishes. But most industries are multi-firm industries where everyone with decision-making power has that same profit motive and the same goals, and they're just trying to figure out the best way to get there. Meanwhile, the audience for games, the gamers, TM, doesn't have the power to do that. The audience can express frustration, but they are the voters in this analogy, not the parties. And the political analogy isn't just being made for no reason here. Within political systems, you only have the options that are on the table. And in a country like the US, that means you only really have two major parties, and there are no minor parties that are doing the work necessary to change that. Voters can choose not to vote, or they can choose to vote for one or the other, but if Party A says 2 and Party B says 4, there's not really a way to manifest a 7 out of that. As a consumer, we don't get to decide what practices the companies engage in. We just get to decide whether or not to engage with them when they do it. And engagement with it shouldn't be seen as unconditional support for the practice. A major difference, however, is that political parties do have an incentive to offer different policies to stand out and appeal to different voters because each voter only has one vote. When it comes to a consumer industry like gaming, you have as many votes as you have dollars, so there's not really an incentive for anyone to offer a radically different option to you since there's nothing stopping you from giving multiple companies money for the same shitty model so long as you're willing to tolerate it. Like in politics, there's not really an advantage to being, Party A light. There's an advantage to Party A and Party B to be distinct enough that people can make a decision between them. If they're both the same, they're just going to pick Party A instead of the knockoff. But when it comes to gaming, there's really nothing stopping you from voting for A and Party A Lite and Party A Lite Remix Edition, Party A Taylor's version. Think about this in the context of music. An artist can release an album, and they can make money off that album, but that doesn't mean that people can't spend money on other albums, or that they can't spend more money on more music that you put out. Taylor Swift right now with the Tortured Poets department is probably the best example of that because she keeps on putting out new versions and new variants to keep her spot in the charts. Frankly, when it comes to gaming, the companies are going to keep doing this shit even if everyone does hate it, and I think it's fair to say that most people do, because if every firm in an industry adopts a position that you hate to some degree, you either stop playing the games or you figure out what shit you're willing to hold your nose to sit in. Another example of this is what happened with checked bags on airplanes. Airlines used to provide 1 or even 2 free checked bags under a certain weight limit. But after American Airlines introduced fees for all checked luggage in 2008, other airlines eventually followed suit, and now that's the norm. Originally, there was obviously pushback, but we've all adjusted to it by this point, and now nobody has an incentive to go back. I mean, sure, an airline that offered free checked baggage would probably draw some more customers. But since nobody else is offering free checked baggage, then it's just leaving money on the table if you choose not to do it. And shareholders don't actually like it when you do that. You might think, fuck the shareholders, long term it's better for the company if they're everybody's favorite because they give people free checked bags. People will go to that airline more. But that's not how things work. When I'm talking about companies having a profit motive under capitalism, that's not just like a feeling. That's not just a vibe. It's not just that they like profits. It's that there's generally a legal obligation to act in the best interest of shareholders and make a profit. And if shareholders feel like you're not doing that, they can usually sue. This is especially the case with airlines, which are basically never profitable and rely overwhelmingly on colossal subsidies from governments, if not outright government ownership just to stay afloat. To look at another example, streaming platforms were, when they initially emerged, primarily a service. Netflix didn't actually produce anything. They were just a middleman providing a service. They gave money to studios for the rights to stream their movies and TV shows, and you gave them money to access their library. Over time, though, that's changed. Netflix began producing its own products, and studios like Disney started their own streaming services that would serve as both a library for existing content and a platform for distributing new products. This changes the dynamic. Being a producer instead of just a middleman means that you now not only have new costs, you have an incentive to prioritize your own products on your own service over the products that you make less money off of. Netflix wants you to watch Netflix originals because it profits more if it doesn't have to share revenue with anyone. Disney isn't going to put its own shows or movies on Netflix anymore because it wants you to have to go through them instead of having to share with Netflix, and because it knows Netflix will prioritize its own products over everyone else's. It'd be easy to see Netflix and Disney as pure competitors here, and to a large extent that's definitely true. They are competing with each other for market share. However, they're not in total direct opposition to each other. Both companies benefit from being able to charge more while providing less, and if either company implements a price hike, it clears the way for the other to do so as well. If one company implements a password sharing ban, then the other is free to follow suit, and eventually it'll get to a point where consumers won't even have the option of paying for a streaming service that allows them to password share, so they'll just have to accept one that doesn't. Within the realm of gaming, this is a big part of why we kind of also don't have a chance to get a more consumer-friendly model. If a new monetization practice is developed that makes more money, all publishers are incentivized to adopt it. They might change up specifics, or they might find an alternative that can get equivalent results, but if it's a publicly traded company, it does have that legal obligation to pursue profits for its shareholders. And if a more anti-consumer model would generate more profits and there's a way to implement it, then that's something they have to at least consider. It's not just that one company normalizes it, it's that one company, whether we're talking about airlines charging for checked bags, streaming services blocking password sharing, or video games locking out more and more content behind paywalls and gambling mechanics, just has to prove it's more profitable to do it than to not. Sometimes it's a relatively small change, so it's easy to implement quickly and roll back quickly if needed, like blocking password sharing. While something like adopting the free-to-play model for a game requires a real commitment to no upfront revenue in exchange for long-term profits, and so tends to get adopted more slowly industry-wide until it's been consistently proven to work. Now, there are some limits to this. For one, you can't just speedrun the process out of nowhere. You can't go 0 to 60, you do still have to ease people in a little bit. You can't start by pricing mythic Overwatch skins at $80. You have to first make them a Battle Pass exclusive for $10 plus a few dozen hours of your time. Then, after a while, you say, hey, instead of making you play the full Battle Pass for this one season exclusive skin, we're instead going to give you mythic prisms that you can spend on any mythic skin that's been released, not just the season's new one. A fully unlocked mythic skin will cost about $80 worth of the premium currency, but you can also unlock that much through the Battle Pass. So even if you can't unlock the whole thing in one season, if you really want it, you can unlock most of it and then save your leftovers for later seasons, or you can use those future seasons to buy the rest of it. And initially, this feels like a net positive for the consumer, especially if you haven't been playing since the start of the game, so you missed out on some of the older mythics that you'd really like for a hero you now play. Like if you started playing in 2024 and you're a Tracer main, you didn't get a chance to get the mythic for her until these prisms came out. And this is the sort of thing that streaming services will do too. You know, it used to feel like an absolute steal to get everything through Netflix instead of having to rent piece by piece through Blockbuster. And then, as more platforms started popping up, most of them offered pretty reasonable rates, so it felt like a decent deal still. Some of these platforms even offered, cheaper plans supplemented by ads and stuff like that. And that didn't really feel like an anti-consumer practice. It felt like you had choices and that people were competing for your attention. But that shit doesn't last. Eventually, the streaming services started cranking up the prices, even when, like Disney Plus, they were making a profit at their old rates. Eventually, Blizzard says, hey, so we know we're giving you $80 worth of mythic prisms each season throughout the Battle Pass, and that would be enough to fully kit out a single mythic, which is the norm. But what if we start introducing multiple mythic products per season? You can get $80 worth of prisms for $10 from the Battle Pass, but now there's 2 mythic cosmetics being introduced in a single season. There was the Ashe mythic skin and the Reinhardt mythic weapon skin. Originally, the promise was that you spend $10, you complete the premium Battle Pass, and you get that season's mythic. Then the promise was that instead of getting a skin outright, you get 80 mythic prisms, which you can spend on that skin or on any other mythic skin. But now there are 2 mythics, and completing a Battle Pass means you're only halfway to getting both of them. You either need to pay for more mythic tokens or use the ones from future Battle Passes to buy this, and no matter how you slice it, the minimum price of unlocking every single mythic across the lifetime of the game has permanently gone up. Especially because this seems like this is going to be the norm now. You're not going to get a season where they give you more mythic prisms than you can spend. So you're always going to be in a little bit of a deficit here. The minimum cost prior to Season 11 was $100, $10 per season for each of the first 10 Battle Passes. With Season 11, that jumped up to $190, another $10 for that season's Battle Pass, plus $80 for the rest of the tokens necessary to buy that hammer. But if you started playing the day that Season 12 started, the price of all the mythic skins for you is now $1,050. $80 for each of the 12 mythic skins that were released in prior seasons, $10 for the Season 12 Battle Pass to get one of the mythics, and another $80 to get the other mythic. Now, is Reinhardt's mythic hammer necessary? No, none of this is necessary, but necessary doesn't really factor into the equation here. Blizzard is doing this for a reason, and that reason is that it wants to make money. Blizzard doesn't really want you to just split your Battle Pass mythic tokens across 2 cosmetics and just be happy with it. They want you to feel like you need to shell out some cash to upgrade them both. They don't want new players to buy Battle Passes and save up the prisms to just slowly unlock past mythics. They want people to feel pressured to buy prisms at an insane markup from the original price that people had paid to unlock them. A price that was presumably kept low so the game would be filled with enough mythics by the time they made the change that new players would feel especially left out for not having any. It isn't a coincidence that the Reinhardt Mythic Hammer came out right after the change to Mythic Prisms, or that that's seemingly going to become the new norm with the Ana Mythic skin coming out in the following season. And it's important to remember, prior to that change, the only premium currencies in Overwatch were Overwatch League tokens and the Overwatch coins. Charging $80 for a single cosmetic with either of those currencies would make it look insanely overpriced, because we've had time now to adjust to what those currencies mean. But Mythic tokens make it look a lot smaller. 80 Mythic tokens doesn't seem nearly as bad a price as 8,000 Overwatch coins, even though it's the same amount. And selling it with Overwatch coins would have invited a more direct comparison between it and the other weapon skins that have been sold. That's the purpose of a premium currency, and especially having multiple of them, it obscures what the actual cost of something is. Like, Blizzard could just sell you it for direct currency. That's not an option that's off the table. All of these companies could. And again, this is a changing practice. Premium currencies weren't always a thing. It sometimes used to be a thing where you could just pay real money for whatever it was you wanted and move on. But over time, it's become more and more normalized to use a premium currency because it obscures the price of whatever you're buying. And again, this was a years-long process for all of this. Overwatch only started offering the Mythic Prisms once the game was old enough that they had a substantial library of Mythic skins to sell this way. And they only started offering things like Mythic Weapon skins outside of the Battle Pass once there was a unique premium currency that they could use to obfuscate the price of the Mythics. And that's before we even get into stuff like League of Legends charging $500 for a fully kitted out Ahri skin. And again, all of this is obviously unnecessary. Like, you don't literally need it. It's not necessary in the slightest. Faker himself literally uses the base Ahri skin instead of the one that's named for him and based around him. And yet they're still charging $500 for it. Why? Part 4. The illusion of a good deal. The reason they do it is because a $500 skin is insane. It's meant to be. If you're a League player, your standard for insane has now been solidly set at $500, meaning that anything lower than that is going to seem reasonable by comparison. Even if you're not a League player, you now know how high the bar has been set. Blizzard charges $80 for that Reinhardt weapon skin or the Ana weapon skin, partially because they're hoping you'll buy it for sure, but also because it sets the bar for insane in Overwatch at $80 for a weapon skin. And for a game that's been pretty consistently criticized for overpriced cosmetics, setting the bar for overpriced to $80 for just a weapon skin means that a $20 full hero skin suddenly doesn't seem so insane. And none of these games exist in a bubble. Every other company has now seen what Riot and Blizzard have done. It doesn't matter if you play League or Overwatch, you've probably seen articles about the insane $80 Reinhardt hammer, or the insane $500 Ahri skin. And that'll inform how you contextualize microtransactions in games like Valorant or Fortnite or Apex Legends or whatever else. And this isn't a one-way road either. Valorant's weapon skins probably played a pretty decent role in making Blizzard think they could get away with their prices. And the Battle Pass plus rotating shop model of Fortnite and Apex both made Blizzard probably think they could get away with that shit too. And to bring it all the way back, this happened in 2006 with the Oblivion horse armor too. If you played Oblivion, you saw that they were charging $2.50 for horse armor and the headlines that were surrounding that news, and it became clear to you that the bar for an absurd microtransaction that charged too much for too little was $2.50 for horse armor. Like, it was absurd at face value, but especially absurd because most players who actually cared about the game and cared about making sure they had a horse that wouldn't die would just do the Dark Brotherhood questline and pick up Shadowmere, an immortal horse who could not die and was also actually pretty useful as an ally in combat. The reason for this is that she was considered an essential NPC, which meant that you could knock her out like any other essential NPC in the game. But unlike those other essential NPCs, knocking Shadowmere unconscious allowed you to loot her and store items in her that she'd carry around without any encumbrance limit once she woke up, making her a glorified U-Haul trailer that could also kick a town guard to death if need be. And the real kicker to all this, like the cherry on top, is that if you were riding pretty objectively the most useful horse in the game, you were unable to equip her with the horse armor even if you did pay for it. And look, I'm sure that Bethesda wanted to make money off of selling the horse armor, but the bigger purpose that it served was to make the rest of their DLC seem like even better value. Oblivion had more DLC than just the horse armor. There was the Vile Lair, the Orrery, the Wizard's Tower, the Fighter's Stronghold, and the Thieves' Den DLCs, which would each unlock unique homes for you focused on various class specializations at about $2 a pop. For $1, you could pay to have spell tomes added to the game, something that would eventually become the default way to learn spells in Skyrim, and for about $3 you get Mehrunes Razor, which added a new dungeon and a unique weapon. For $10, you could buy the Knights of the Nine DLC, which added a new story and questline, and for about $30, you could buy the game's major expansion, the Shivering Isles, which is a massive new region with new enemies, characters, storylines, and quests. And all of that was preceded by the Horse Armor, which was the game's first bit of DLC. $2.50 for horse armor was firmly established as an insane ask, but it meant that when you were asked to spend $2 for a new property that was genuinely useful, you were comparing its value to the horse armor. If you were a mage, spell tomes were a $1 purchase that would unlock new spells for you and, crucially, replace about a quarter of the single-use spell scrolls in the game with tomes that allowed you to permanently learn a spell. And sure, they probably should have been part of the base game or a free update or whatever, but at least it provides more utility than fucking horse armor for 2.5 times the price. Mehrunes Razor costs a little bit more than the horse armor, but even if you didn't want to buy it, it wasn't that hard to see that it was also better value. Knights of the Nine costs 4 times as much as horse armor, and Shivering Isles costs about 12 times as much, and in both cases, it's really easy to argue that you're getting way better value for those relative to horse armor. And again, even if you didn't play Oblivion at the time, you probably still saw the headlines. It sets expectations that an entire industry can exploit because now everyone knows that $250 is absurd for horse armor. But if you can provide more value than the equivalent of $2.50 per 1 unit of horse armor equivalent content, then it's not the worst deal the consumer has heard of. All these companies are using each other's prices to inform what their prices should be. They can't outright fix prices, they can't directly collaborate, but they can pretty easily work around each other to make sure that the rising tide lifts all ships that are willing to play ball. Sometimes somebody moves too fast and fucks up in a way that just harms them without really helping them, like Star Wars Battlefront 2. Maybe they thought that people's standards were already low enough that would fly, or maybe they hadn't really anticipated how their terrible communications would make the situation even worse for them. But it's not like they weren't trying to play the game, they just lost. Part of why we develop a tolerance to being gouged is that these companies and their marketing teams aren't stupid. A $20 legendary Overwatch skin is a gamble from Blizzard where the goal is to make the $10 battle pass look like stupidly good value. That's the one they're trying to sell. After all, if a legendary skin is worth $20 and you accept that that's what it should be worth, and you can get 5 of those for $10 in the battle pass, then the battle pass has a $100 value in terms of its legendaries for just $10. A 50% off deal compared to just a single legendary and 90% off for the 5, let alone all the other cosmetics that are in the battle pass. Like, you're practically losing money if you don't buy it. Plus, there's all those epic skins, the emotes, the victory poses, the sprays, and the voice lines, and all that other stuff adds up to the battle pass seeming like amazing value. Even if, on closer inspection, you might realize that you never use 90% of the battle pass cosmetics. They're not really there for you to use, they're there to up the value of it to make it look like a good deal. And sure, it's not like they don't expect anyone to buy those $20 store legendaries either. They do, they expect somebody to do it, and that's a win-win for them. Blizzard makes money off of selling a handful of overpriced shop skins and off the battle passes that are more likely to be bought because the overpriced shop skins make it seem like better value. $80 for a mythic skin is insane, but you can get one for just $10 through the battle pass. And sure, you need to spend an extra $80 to get the weapon skin, but you don't have to if you don't want to. If you want it, you can get it for just $10. Even if spending the battle pass is $10 worth of mythic prisms on one skin comes with an $80 opportunity cost to the other. Hell, that just makes it look like an even better deal that you got the one that you wanted for $10. The purpose of horse armor wasn't really to sell horse armor. I mean, again, they probably wanted to sell a bunch of it, but Bethesda would have known that it would go over poorly, especially as the game's first DLC. The purpose of it, what it was meant to do, was to make every other piece of DLC for the game, whether it was a full-fledged story and questline or just a microtransaction with some new houses or dungeons or simple quality of life upgrades, seem more reasonable. Charging $80 worth of mythic prisms for a Reinhardt weapon skin or an Ana weapon skin isn't really about trying to get you to buy more mythic prisms in the grand scheme of things. They'll happily sell you them, they'll let you wail out on it, but it's to make the prisms that you can get from the battle pass seem even more valuable, and to make the standard shop cosmetics seem like better value by comparison. Hell, I would argue that the $500 Ari skin is an intentional, explicit attempt to do this. For one, it's not really $500, it's technically more like $440 in terms of the actual RP if it's a direct conversion. It's also just one of 3 bundles that each have different versions of the same core skin, with the cheapest being the Risen Legend collection for about $40 to $50, and the middle bundle being the Immortalized collection for about $220 in terms of actual RP. However, the most expensive bundle is the Signature Immortalized Legend collection at 59,260 RP. And since you can't buy that exact amount, the best value for you is probably to buy 5 $100 stacks of 13,500 RP apiece. And Riot could have pushed back and said that it was only $440, which is significantly less than $500, but they really didn't. And while part of the reason is definitely that they just get clowned on for trying to split hairs or whatever, I think the bigger reason why they didn't is that the bundle is meant to set expectations. All of them are. They want you to think of that top bundle as being $500, the middle one as being $250, and the cheapest as being $50. And in doing so, Riot is saying, we consider $500 to be good value for the most premium cosmetics, $250 to be good value for the middle of the road bundles, and $50 to be the cheapest we'll go for something premium like this. They're saying all that with the hope that you'll internalize that messaging, that that's what you will start to value things as well. That'll be your benchmark for each of these things. And what effect do you think that's going to have on the consumer when they go to the shop and see that pool party set is only $13.50 RP, like around $10? Well, it tells them they're getting a fucking steal. After all, Riot thinks that $50 is a fair price for the low end of a premium cosmetic. So by comparison, $10 for a solid skin that set players are going to like is pretty great. KDA Ari, whether we're talking about the original or the all-out line, costs about $10 too. And those skins are also great. You can buy one overpriced bundle that even Riot acknowledges has the least content out of all those Faker-related bundles for $50. Or you could buy the KDA all-out skins for Evelynn, Ari, Kai'Sa, and Akali, plus the basic KDA Ari skin for the same amount. Or you could buy both of the Ari KDA skins, as well as the Seraphine KDA all-out skin that costs about $30 and comes with 3 separate variants that tell a whole story about her for that same amount. You could buy the Spirit Blossom skins for Set and Aphelios that make them both canonically fruity for each other and still have spent less than half the cost of that cheapest bundle. You could buy all 27 of the skins connected to the League of Legends musical acts, Heartsteel, KDA, Pentakill, and True Damage, for about as much money as the Immortalized Legend collection with just a single Ari skin and a handful of other cosmetics. And especially if you don't care about esports or Faker or whatever, then it seems even more absurd to charge $500 for it and makes everything else seem like a better deal by comparison. And it's important for us to remember that it really wasn't always this way. Like, never forget, you used to once upon a time just buy a $60 AAA game, go home, get whatever enjoyment you could out of it, and then maybe buy like a map pack if it's a multiplayer game, or maybe buy a set of outfits for the characters, or maybe pay a few bucks extra for an extra character. If you went back to 2016 and told people who were just a few months into Overwatch 1 that this is the monetization model that would eventually emerge, they'd probably either not believe you or be angry at the notion of stuff like free loot boxes being eventually removed. If you went back to 2006 and tried to explain either model to people, they'd probably laugh at the idea of a game where almost every single cosmetic is either only available for free for a couple of months through a battle pass, requires at least $10 for a premium battle pass, or costs $20 per skin for the week if it's in the shop, or where you just have to gamble on it. Hell, you'd have to explain a battle pass to them. Like, okay, let me ask you this. When do you think season passes for DLC started to become a thing? Like, what do you think was the first one? What game kicked it off? You can pause the video if you'd like and see if you can remember the year or maybe even the game. All right, okay, so the answer is in 2011, with LA Noire being the first and Mortal Kombat 9 following immediately behind it that same year. That's only 13 years ago. Do you know how old battle passes are? Like, I'm not gonna give you the time to guess, they're 11 years old. The first game to have one was Dota 2 in 2013. These aren't old practices. We do not have to live like this. The sun still rose in the east and set in the west 20 years ago before this kind of bullshit was part of gaming. Games companies haven't been forced to adopt these practices because they're just little guys who can't afford to keep the lights on if you don't pay them $60 a year every year for battle passes. It's because the people at the top are overwhelmingly either billionaires or millionaires who are looking to become billionaires the same way those other billionaires did. And when we're talking about how we, as consumers, are getting gouged here, it's important to remember that they're not really trying to gouge most of us out of $500 for signature Immortalized Legend Ari. They're not really trying to gouge most of us out of $80 for a bound Demon Reinhardt hammer. They weren't even really trying to gouge most of us out of $250 for horse armor. I mean, those are absurd prices for what they are, and the people who are paying for those things are all people who had built up significantly higher tolerances to getting gouged than the average person. And they are being gouged, but that's an extremely small minority of the audience. For the average consumer, they're using those prices to skew your perspective. They expect most people to balk at $500 for an Ari skin because it makes a $20 Ari skin look a lot less egregious. They expect most people to balk at an $80 weapon skin so that a $60 Transformers collab mega bundle looks better, especially compared to buying all 4 Transformers bundles separately for $25 a piece. They expect most people to balk at charging $250 for horse armor because it means you're evaluating the $30 story DLC based on how much more relative value it provides. And it's important to remember, there's nobody competing with them within their own game marketplace. You can't make an Overwatch skin and try and sell it and see if you can compete with a better price. These are hostage markets that only one company can compete in, so of course they're ramping up the prices. Last year when I made my video about how Overwatch's cosmetics create a culture of classism, some people complained that they felt I was saying that they should feel bad for spending their money on these cosmetics, that they worked hard for their money and should get to choose how they spend it. And look, I agree. We are all free to buy a little treat from time to time, and it's not like I think that Ari signature Immortal Legend users deserve the wall or something. I have spent my money on a great deal of stupid things in my life, including the VTuber model that I'm currently using that I promise you costs far more than anyone spent on those fucking RE bundles. The point of this video isn't to shame you for spending your money, or to make you feel dumb for falling for the ways that they try and manipulate consumers. The point is that these companies are actively trying to fuck with your perception of the value of your own dollar to try and convince you to hand over as many of them as possible, and it's important to remember that. The $500 RE skin isn't just for the people who will buy it, it's for everyone who will have their perception of every other cosmetic's value shifted to seem more reasonable by comparison. And I don't think it's hard to argue that this is a strategy that works. More and more of these companies are realizing that the way to gouge you isn't just to try and slowly up the prices. It's to introduce new products that are absurdly bad value for the consumer, either due to a high price or just low value, that make all their other prices seem less egregious. It's making you think you're getting an absolute steal on a water bottle for $10 because they sell an ultra premium water bottle bundle for $50. The reason our tolerance has increased is because, after a while, we normalize how we perceive these things. We normalize what acceptable prices are now, and it's possible to then raise the standard again using the same practices. I mean, sure, a $500 RE bundle is extreme now, but like, what about in 5 years? Maybe they'll put out a couple more premium bundles for like $100, or they'll do some sort of special collab or like a KDA thing for $250 for a bundle. And over time, $500 is gonna stop seeming so extreme. Eventually, that'll become something that's within the range of valid options. This is not a video about admonishing consumers. Yes, even the ones who do buy the insanely overpriced cosmetics, because again, they're being gouged too. It's about reminding you that you are not immune to marketing strategies, that companies are playing 4D chess with millions of dollars in market research to back it to separate you from your dollars, and that it's important to be wary so that we don't develop a tolerance to being gouged. The unfortunate reality is that this probably isn't a problem we can just solve outright as consumers. This sort of thing is something that would only really change if regulations were actively introduced to force companies to abandon the practices. And realistically, there's probably like a single-digit number of legislators in the world who even know who Faker is, not just that league's using him and his legacy to manipulate consumers. On an individual level, though, we can be conscious of how our perception is being influenced by these marketing moves, and focus on protecting ourselves from falling prey to them. It's not about never buying anything again, it's about consciously asking yourself, is this thing actually worth $20? Or does it only seem like it because they were charging $100 for something similar, so this feels like it must be a good deal? It's about looking at absurdly bad value microtransactions and consciously being aware that this is a strategy to make you perceive other microtransactions more favorably. And it's about pitting consumers against each other so that you blame the person who spent $500 on the RE skin bundle, or you blame the person who spent $80 on a Reinhardt hammer, rather than blaming the companies who are trying to drag more people in and using FOMO, using marketing strategies to try and get as many people to fall for the bait as they can. We have not built a tolerance to being gouged just because we're ignorant to our own peril like the boiling frog. And we have not built a tolerance to being gouged because we let the companies ratchet up the prices and then don't do anything about it. They are trying to induce a tolerance in you towards being gouged because their shareholders want to buy another fucking yacht. And while there is nothing wrong with buying something because you want it, there's also nothing wrong with being sure that you enter every transaction with clear eyes about how much effort has been put into trying to skew your perspective and convince you to see a bad deal as a steal by putting it next to an even worse one. Anyways, that's where I'm going to end this one. Thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and a big thank you to Gumio. They got to pick out the topic of this video as a donathon reward, and I'm really happy with how it's turned out. If you liked it, be sure to comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff if you haven't already. And if you're not a channel member, consider becoming one. Each month, my channel members get to pick one video topic for me to make, and for August, they've chosen Why Listen to the Players Doesn't Work, which should be coming out next week. Most of the losing topics will be making comebacks in future months, with In Defensive V3 being the first returnee for the September poll alongside all these other topics. Memberships cost $5 a month, and if you buy one at any point in August, your membership will be active for the next poll. Plus, just my members are a huge part of why I'm able to keep making these videos, so if you'd like to support the channel, it would be greatly appreciated. Speaking of, thank you very much to all my channel members. Minnie Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Dextiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Cadent, Windex the Great, Deleathers, V, Gavost, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Ikri, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, Hazmat Attic Games, Mariah, and Amon Dodley. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.